So I want to welcome you to the first session of our four-part series, Economic Justice, Interreligious Reflections on Fairness and Dignity. My name is Heather Miller-Rubens, and I'm the Executive Director and Roman Catholic Scholar here at ICJS. As we get started tonight, I'd like to welcome everyone who is joining us. It's really great to see so many familiar faces as well as some new friends. I want to extend a particular word of welcome to the alumni of our Congregational Leaders Fellowship. And I'd like to invite members of the 2021 CLF Fellowship to rename yourself and to put CLF at the beginning of your name so that we can assign you to a special breakout room. If you have never renamed yourself on Zoom, it is very easy. All you have to do is click the three dots in the upper right-hand corner of your video picture of yourself, and then click the rename link. And again, we are inviting you to put CLF at the beginning. I also want to extend a special welcome to the students of Morgan State University who are joining us for this series from the class of Dr. Harold Morales. We are so very glad that you are here at ICJS. In order to take attendance for Dr. Morales, we are asking that you also rename yourself on Zoom with MSU at the beginning of your name. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the really difficult week our Morgan State students who are joining us for this course have had. For those of you who do not know, a handful of historically Black colleges and universities were targeted with bomb threats this week, including Morgan State University here in Baltimore. As we dive into our interreligious discussion tonight, we want to acknowledge the role that religion has often played in white supremacy in the United States. Please know that at ICJS, we reject racism and white supremacy and condemn those who use violence and threats to disrupt your learning and attempt to harm your sense of safety. We hope that any folks who have been historically marginalized for their race are able to find a space here at ICJS that is welcoming. Our mission is to combat bigotry and bias, and we will work to include more programs that directly address the intersection of race and religion as we move towards a more just society that is both multi-religious and multiracial. So thank you for being with us here tonight. All right, so we're going to spend the next few minutes providing an orientation to what we're hoping to accomplish during our time together during the next 4 weeks. Economic justice is a really big and important topic for discussion. And as we have said in our course description, that the place and position of wealth directly impacts our sort of conception and the functioning of a broader society. So making sure that you're signed up for the right class, we're going to be drawing on Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions to explore how discrepancies in wealth and status affect our communities. And we're inviting 3 key questions to consider in the weeks ahead, which is the question first, when is a society economically just? Our religious traditions are sort of holistic world building traditions. They have something to say about pretty much everything from the moment you're born to the moment you die, sort of the cradle to grave systems, right? So what they say about society and how money functions in society is very much part of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. And when a society is economically just is certainly a question that our religious communities, thinkers, leaders, and sacred texts have wrestled with for a very long time. So then that we invites the question, can our religious texts and traditions still offer wisdom and insights and challenges for grappling with economic justice today? And in this course, the presumption behind that is yes, that our texts do have something to say to this moment and to this question. And then finally, what we're hoping to do is to show that interreligious learning can inspire us to improve the economic environment in our communities and bring a greater opportunity and dignity for all. So that's the kind of the hopes that we have for this course in particular. Our outcomes for the class, I want to sort of talk about, there's 3 major outcomes that we're hoping everyone will walk away with at the end of the 4 weeks. And we're going to check in on this during each session. We really want you to understand and appreciate some of the wisdom and insights from select examples from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions on fairness, dignity, and economic justice, right? We only have a few hours together, so we're not doing a comprehensive sweep by any stretch of the imagination, but we are hoping that the insights that you will glean from these select examples will be some things that you can take with you. We also really want to make the case that religious difference and the way that people can talk about religion in the public square can be a positive thing, and that our religious traditions have something to add to public conversations, particularly around justice topics. So we want you to be comfortable with the idea of religious diversity in the public square and to see it as a potential force for good. And then finally, we want to create space for you to better equip to name the challenges and the opportunities and the values that inform your own views on fairness, dignity, and economic justice. So those are the course outcomes that we're hoping for. A quick overview of tonight and the weeks ahead, as well as your instructors. Tonight, I will be leading the welcome, as well as giving an example from Roman Catholic tradition. My colleagues will explore different topics in the weeks ahead. Zainab Salegan will talk about Muslim reflections. Ben Sachs will talk about Jewish reflections, and Matt Taylor will round us out with Protestant reflections and wrapping up the course. And so it's a 4-week commitment. And then finally, our agenda for tonight. We're talking about the logistics of the class and sort of what we're doing right now. And now we're going to slide into sort of the first learning for this evening, which is to talk about shoulder-to-shoulder dialogue and to really reflect, well, what does interreligious dialogue on economic justice mean, and how am I approaching this topic? Then we'll have our first breakout session. You're going to be assigned to random breakout rooms, and you will have facilitators from ICJS, trained facilitators in your breakout rooms to help with conversation. You'll have 20 minutes in small group, and then we'll come back together. In the second hour, I will talk about Dorothy Day and the concept of the deserving and undeserving poor, and sort of explore how Dorothy Day is interpreting the Gospel of Matthew, as well as the corporal works of mercy. And then we'll have a second opportunity to go back into the same breakout rooms that you had before for another 20-minute, again, facilitated conversation. And then we'll come back together and conclude by 9 o'clock. So that's the kind of scope for the evening. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about types of dialogue at ICJS, but also interreligious dialogue in general. So the first category I want to talk about is face-to-face dialogue. And this is what your tradition says about me and my tradition, and what my tradition says about you and your tradition. A lot of times we're trying to imagine how we operate within each other's religious texts, as well as and how we've interpreted those texts together and against one another. This is a space for dismantling directly bias and bigotry from within our religious traditions. So some examples of this are kind of addressing Christian anti-Semitism, addressing Jewish Islamophobia, Muslim anti-Semitism, those types of dialogues. And a lot of ICJS programs adopt this modality. Another opportunity is the shoulder-to-shoulder dialogue. And this is really focusing in on what our religious traditions say about the world, and how can we bring the best thinking from our religious traditions to social and societal problems. So this is where, instead of kind of facing one another and saying, well, what does your text say about me? We're all kind of lining up together and saying, well, what's going on in our world? And what do our religious traditions say about those problems? How can we bring the wisdom of those traditions to bear on shared concerns? And so examples from this can come from, Muslim views on healthcare and vaccine, Christian thinking on education, Jewish thoughts on justice, Christian thinking on face masks, right? These are these types of questions. The interreligious society that we envision at ICJS is dependent upon both kinds of dialogues. But this course in particular is a shoulder-to-shoulder course, right? So we're looking at issues of economic justice, and we're drawing from our religious traditions to say, what is some of the best thinking that can happen on that topic? And how do our religious traditions help us think differently, think better, think in a more creative way about that? I want to briefly kind of talk, if this is your first time at ICJS, about our vision as an organization. We are working towards an interreligious society in which dialogue replaces division, friendship overcomes fear, and education eradicates ignorance. And this course assumes, again, the shoulder-to-shoulder work, but that interreligious learning and dialogue is possible around economic justice, and that it in fact is necessary if we're going to actually work to build a better community together. So that's a sort of presumption of the class as a whole. And I want to take a moment to talk about the sort of modality of dialogue versus debate. And hopefully you got in your pre-work the opportunity to watch the 3-minute video in preparation for tonight. There'll always be a little bit of prep work before each class. We're going to limit it to about 15 minutes of prep work, so it's not going to be onerous, but we do hope you take the time to do that. But I think it's important to sort of say that dialogue is really focused on this idea of listening to learn and not listening to respond right away or listening to challenge. That we're not trying to sort of debate these topics. We're actually trying to think creatively with other people who may hold very different positions about these topics. But you may have some concerns or some fears about interreligious learning and dialogue, particularly around economic justice. And so we wanted to name those concerns, right? That dialogue is perhaps not possible on this topic. Indeed, a lot of justice issues are framed as debate issues, that dialogue is just not possible, that dialogue is potentially dehumanizing or not even somewhere you can go. We don't hold that for this topic in particular or for as an organization. Another thing you can be concerned about is that your relationships would be adversely affected when you're sort of being vulnerable and talking about how you feel or think about a particular topic. You worry about how that lands with the people in your small group. You may have some literacy anxieties. Either you don't know enough about the economic issues or you don't know enough about the religious texts or traditions. These are all fears that people bring into the space. You may be kind of wondering right now, well, what's something else, an anxiety that you might be bringing into it? We again are creating a facilitated dialogue space, and we're inviting you to sort of put those fears aside and to really open and explore this possibility with us here tonight. Again, we have some resources on our website if you want to think further about this. We have our dialogue versus debate guidelines, and we also have the video which we shared in advance and which will be available on the website linked to this class in particular. All right, so we are delightfully ahead of schedule. So I think we'll actually maybe leave about 25 minutes for the breakout rooms, so that this is going to be the first session where everyone gets to know one another. Your facilitators will introduce themselves, and we're going to think about how we're showing up to this topic and how we're what we're bringing into this class. And so there are 3 discussion questions that we want you to think about and engage in small group conversation with in this first breakout session. One is to reflect on what your connection is to religion. And that can be a very simple answer, or it can be a very complicated answer. All are welcome, and there really are no wrong answers to that question. So please be true to yourself. We also want to invite you to think about the topic that we're considering. What does fairness and dignity and economic justice look like to you? And then we want you to put those things together. How does your religious upbringing or your religious traditions inform your views on economic justice? So this is the kind of numbers part of our conversation this evening, and it's a really short slide. And I just wanted to do this because I wanted to name the reality of poverty and how much it's a tragic part of American society, but how that's not only present today, but has been part of American society for quite a while. And we will see when we talk about Dorothy Day this evening, this is a topic that she was addressing 100 years ago in the early part of the 20th century, and a lot of the same challenges facing America today were similar to what was facing America then. And so I think it's really important when we have these justice conversation that we do know some facts about poverty, which is what we've pulled together on this slide. But what I want to contend and how the ICJS course and the dialogue work that we're doing tonight is a little bit different is that I want to say that facts like this are just sort of not enough as we want to try to chart a new path forward. And that we must also pay very close attention to the stories that we tell about poverty and the stories that we tell and the beliefs that we hold about the poor in the American context. And Dorothy Day is really challenging a kind of thread of a story about poor people in America that I think will resonate with everyone today. Because I think at the end of the day, how you think about the poor and how you think about the causes of poverty will directly impact how you can approach solutions to poverty and how you can approach policy recommendations. And so again, pulling this from the Census Bureau, just the stark numbers of this, I think are really important to try to wrap your head around. That 37.2 million Americans are currently living in poverty. So that's a little bit over 10% of the population. And that 17.3 of those folks are living in deep poverty, so below 50% of the poverty threshold. And I also just want to highlight how many children are living in poverty in the United States at this point, which is 18%. And these are just really just startling numbers. And again, you could see that the chart over time and how this is mapped out in the last few years. But again, the story that we're going to tell today is not only a numbers story, but really a kind of digging into how we understand and talk about the poor and talk about poverty. So Dorothy Day, if you are not familiar with her, she is an American Catholic who was born in 1897 and died in 1980. She is famously known as a social activist, and her focus of her work and her life and her mission was on poverty and the poor. And she wrote copiously. She has a tremendous, she's left us a tremendous amount of writing and thinking theologically and practically about addressing poverty and serving and living with the poor. She is the founder of the Catholic Worker, and the Catholic Worker is both a movement, but it also is a newspaper, and it's still in existence today. So there are kind of two main parts to the Catholic Worker movement. There was an urban part or a city part, and there are Catholic worker houses. There's one here in Baltimore, but they're in a lot of cities across the United States to this day. Where men and women of all faiths, you just have to commit yourself to the Catholic worker principles, come together and live, work, and serve in poor communities. They provide housing and they provide food to those in need. There's also was an agrarian part of the vision of the Catholic worker movement. Was not as prolific, but there are still some Catholic worker farms in the United States today. And again, the Catholic worker newspaper, Dorothy Day wrote and edited it for a very long time, but it still exists and is in print today. So within Catholic tradition, she is on the road to sainthood. She is officially a servant of God, which is the sort of first title that you get when you are on the way to canonization. And she is in the process as we speak. I want to highlight that when Pope Francis was invited to speak to a joint session of Congress back in 2015, he lifted up Dorothy Day in particular when he was addressing Congress at that time. And I pulled a small quote from his address, and I will stop and read it out loud. It should be on your screens as well. In these times when social concerns are so important, I cannot fail to mention the servant of God, Dorothy Day, who founded the Catholic worker movement. Her social activism, her passion for justice, and for the cause of the oppressed were inspired by the gospel, her faith, and the example of the saints. And the emphasis, the bold is added by me. And why I'm highlighting this quote is Pope Francis is pointing out a very important fact, which is Dorothy Day's action, her activism, and her sort of writing and thinking about poverty was deeply, deeply, deeply informed by her interpretation of scripture, and how she also understood the tradition of saints within the church and how she embraced really all aspects of her Catholic faith. And so one of the texts that I asked you to prepare for tonight that we're not going to do a deep text study on, but is a really critical background to understanding the text we will be reading from Dorothy Day, is the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. If we could put that in the chat for folks who may, if you haven't read it in advance, we'll put that in the chat to make it available to you. But this is the story of separating the sheep from the goats, and sort of and Christian understanding who's going to go to heaven, who's going to be saved from this, and what does it take to be saved. And the teaching comes that when you're hungry, you give me food. When I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. And I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. So all of these moments where another human being expressed a need, if you responded positively to that need and you helped that person, it was as if you were helping Jesus. And so that was a kind of a marker or an understanding that you would be accepted into heaven. So this sort of sense of aid is actually really critical for understanding the sense of Christian salvation. So that's the kind of background text from the Gospel of Matthew that really shaped and formed Dorothy Day's political vision. So this is the text that I want us to consider tonight in our breakout rooms. And I'm going to spend some time reading it out loud and then some time unpacking it just a little bit. And then we're going to consider also how that conversation happens today. So I really want to explore this idea of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor. And Dorothy Day wrote this article in the 1940s. So again, this is a while ago, but I think it's worth revisiting now. So I'm just going to read it out loud while you can follow along on your screens. Many times we have borne the charge that houses of hospitality, this quote unquote new wrinkle, do more harm than good. It is said that they perpetuate chronic laziness and drunkenness. The communists ask us, how can you say that you're against capitalism when you keep it alive by feeding the poor on the crumbs of the rich? We are told to discriminate on the side of the quote unquote deserving poor. This new wrinkle was old long before we appeared on the scene. Christ once told his disciples, I was hungry and you gave me to eat, etc. Since that day, all over the world, pilgrims to holy places, weary travelers, the hungry, the thirsty, saint and sinner, have been succored in the name of Christ. Hospices, centuries ago, were under the supervision of the bishops. They were set up in lonely and hostile regions. Lepers by the thousands were helped in the many hospices scattered all over France. The monks of St. Bernard are famous for their hospitality. The work of these monks was started back in 962. The early monasteries founded by Benedict of Nursia designated monks as hospitallers and almoners. The former welcomed guests while the latter fed, clothed, and gave shelter to the needy. There is no record in the history of hospices and hospitality of discrimination. So again, she is being charged, right? So she's starting up a movement. She's setting up houses of hospitality in cities around the country. Catholic workers are doing this in imitation of Dorothy Day and in solidarity with the movement. And they're just feeding and sheltering people, regardless of what, what is going on with them. And so, and she is being charged by a lot of critics as saying that they should only help the deserving poor, that by helping everyone, you're sort of breeding and participating in moral decline. And this idea is really pervasive in American culture. And so I want to kind of fast forward to today. So in 2017, President Trump invited the UN to do an analysis on poverty in the United States. And there was a special UN report that came out in 2017. This is an excerpt from this report. I have been struck by the extent to which caricatured narratives about the purported innate differences between the rich and the poor have been sold to the electorate by some politicians and media and have been allowed to define the debate. The rich are industrious, entrepreneurial, patriotic, and the drivers of economic success. The poor are wasters, losers, and scammers. As a result, money spent on welfare is money down the drain. To complete the picture, we are also told that the poor who want to make it in America can easily do so. They really can achieve the American dream if only they worked hard enough. Again, so there's a sense of morality and poverty. How do we think about the poor? Are they deserving or are they undeserving? Can they work hard enough, or are they a waster or a loser or a scammer? Right? This idea about poverty is something that is really deeply embedded in the United States. And it really then shapes how you can address the problem, how you can address the sort of horrific numbers that we talked about earlier in the evening. So this is the question. And I think we have about, I think time for about 30 minutes in the breakout room for this question. So Dorothy Day, her reading of the Gospel of Matthew points to a very different conclusion. She sort of challenges this idea that there are deserving poor and undeserving poor. She thinks that this idea is antithetical to the gospel message of Matthew and to Christian tradition, including the works of mercy and the traditions of hospitality and the monks and the saints. That somehow assistance should only go to certain types of deserving people, and that giving assistance to the undeserving will breed laziness, substance abuse, or further contribute to individual moral decline. So that's the thing that she is really challenging with us today. So as we go back into our small groups, what do you think about this category? How do you understand this deserving or undeserving poor? And what do you think of Dorothy Day's argument, right? Which she put out into the public square, where she's using the Gospel of Matthew to say, no, if you're hungry, I'm going to feed you. If you're coming to seek shelter, I'm going to give you a bed. And if you need clothes, I'm going to help you out. So I also want you to think about this personally, sort of in your organization, your work, your life. How do you judge or characterize certain people who are deserving or undeserving of your help, right? How do you make those determinations? How might removing that distinction, if somebody comes to ask you for help, do they deserve your help? Do they deserve your time? If you remove that distinction, how might that change things for you in a positive way? If every time someone sought out your assistance, were you able to just say yes? But how might that be really, really hard, right? How might removing that distinction of deserving, undeserving be challenging or difficult? We're a pretty judgmental society. I'm also a judgmental person myself, right? What would happen if you just removed that? If you removed that layer, is that what the gospel is calling us to do? So just a quick reminder on what we're hoping that you'll get out of the whole course, but also each session as we go through this, is just to understand and appreciate the wisdom and insights from select examples. And this evening we learned from Dorothy Day and her Catholic interpretation of the Gospel of Matthew and the works of mercy, to thinking about how we understand a response to the poor and how we think about the poor. We want to also make an argument that and to equip you to have better conversations about the potential positive role that religious difference can play in public conversations, that bringing these religious ideas into public debates and sort of having these conversations about the deserving and undeserving poor can help advance broader public conversations about fairness, dignity, and economic justice. And finally, we want to create space for you to have time to reflect on your own religious and spiritual values that inform your views on fairness, dignity, and economic justice. If you're interested in thinking more about American myths on poverty, there was a really lovely podcast series from On the Media in 2016 that has a couple of episodes. I believe it's a 6-episode series. And the second episode deals with this idea of the deserving and undeserving poor in American history and sort of its life in the United States. And so if you wanted to do a deeper dive into this topic, I recommend this podcast series. You'll get an email with the link with it tomorrow as well. And so if you want to follow up with that, please do. This is not required homework. This is optional homework if you want to do something more. And then a second, then we'll wrap it up for the evening. I just want to say that the second session for this series will be taught by my colleague, Dr. Zainab Salegan, next week, February 10th. Same time, same Zoom. And she's going to look at Saeed Nursi on the topic of justice and the rights and responsibilities of individuals. And we hope that you will join us again via Zoom next week at 7 o'clock. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us on this journey to have interreligious conversations on economic justice. Be well, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Good night.
Thank you.